Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
They're not, saying the quiet part out loud as far as they're concerned. They see no reason why they shouldn't rule the world and, make everybody bend the knee. And, when you start talking about this, you do sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist until you point out that it's not like, some evil scheming mania. It's just a philosophy that these are the anointed and they should rule, and the implications of that will out and have been showing themselves to all who have eyes to see. We can talk about it until we're blue in the face, but people that don't get this are still just like it can't possibly be the case that they really do, they actually want to rule the world.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the Publishers and Editors podcast here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind. I'm joined by executive editor of the American Mind, James Polis, managing editor, Seth Barron, and features editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review books, Spencer Clavin. I wanted to open today with a tweet thread. Nobody really famous or anything. Don't even know what her following is, but she did us all a good service. She can be found at _Laura, Laura_. She says the following, and I thought it would be a nice occasion to talk a bit about the possible states we are in post-COVID, should we ever get post-COVID, and where our ruling class wants to take us. That is our increasingly international or globalist ruling class. So she says, I listened to Fauci, Stephane Bancel from Moderna, Annalise Wilder-Smith, and Richard Hatchett discuss the future of COVID at Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum yesterday. Klaus Schwab, of course, the Great Reset guy. Here are my notes. Bloomberg's moderator, Francine Lacqua, says the public can submit questions to the panel using a QR code. This is the beauty of 2022, she says. We know how QR codes work. Now is the time to thank your higher power for gracing us with the beauty of QR codes. Fauci says we aren't going to eradicate the virus, and it will be like the flu, becoming endemic with seasonal pandemics. We will continue to get more variants, and we don't know if they will elude the immune response. Wilder-Smith says it's likely future variants will be less dangerous, but we need to prepare for the worst-case scenario, a variant with high transmissibility and mortality. Hatchett says we should be concerned about future pandemics even after it becomes endemic. Moderna is expecting a new Omicron version of their vaccine to go to regulators for approval in March. Moderna is also working on the new version to be released in the fall 2022. Let me emphasize that, in addition to the initial 2-dose series plus booster, in 2022, you will be expected to be vaccinated again in the spring and in the fall. No mention if these new formulations will be single shots or multi-dose series. Moderna is focusing on how to make people want the vaccine to overcome compliance issues. They will combine COVID, flu, and RSV vaccines into a single shot for fall 2023. Fauci says herd immunity is elusive because this virus has an extraordinary capability to mutate. Unlike viruses like the measles, immunity from infection wanes rather quickly. Vaccines are extraordinarily successful, but immunity can also wane. Moderator asks how to bridge the divide between believers and non-believers. This is definitely not a cult, people. That's Laura's one of her many editorializing bits, as you might have gathered. Fauci, followed by the others, laughs and then launches into a tirade against non-believers. Fauci, there are some inherent non-believers that, no matter what you say, give you a real problem. We should fight the real enemy, the virus, but instead have to fight disinformation on social media, which is destructive to their comprehensive public health endeavor, theirs meaning Fauci et al. Moderna is likewise saddened by the misinformation. When she says Moderna, she's talking for Moderna spokesperson, of course. We have to get people to believe in vaccines. The enemy is not another company or another group. The enemy has only been the virus and is still the virus. Hatchett discusses that they are seeking the holy grail of vaccines, which will protect against all possible variants instead of having to vaccinate every few months. Fauci adds that we still might need boosters even after this vaccine to end all vaccines is developed. Fauci discusses the situation in the U.S., blaming a disturbing pushback against regular, normal, easy to understand, and well-recognized public health measures like masks, vaccination, and other things. We give the virus an advantage when we don't act in a unified way. Moderator asks if we should be implementing education campaigns in schools to push vaccines. Wilder Smith sidesteps and says we need to educate the medical community because they are a source of conspiracy theories. The Moderna lady says that before the problem was vaccine supply, but now they have warehouses full of doses. The African Union said they don't want the doses they had reserved. The problem is getting these doses into arms. We're almost done, I promise. Fauci defines the new normal as much greater attention to respiratory viruses in the future. We will not always mask. We need more global solidarity and corporate memory. Last question. With 2020 hindsight, what should we have done differently? Fauci says we should have had a more coordinated global response because the virus circulating in any part of the world is a threat to everyone. This is a final tweet from our note taker, of course, editorializing herself. I want to emphasize that answer. Fauci considered everything that has happened during the pandemic, and the only area that needed improvement was that other countries should have followed his lead more closely. This man truly has a God complex. So there were a couple other threads that were interesting about growing out of that notes-taking session, but I think the most interesting part about it is it's kind of a hoary cliche these days to bandy about terms like fascism or communism. But it seems to me this sort of new biomedical technocratic push by Fauci and all the others, backed up by what seems like a good section of public opinion, craving against, or really at any cost, safety from this respiratory virus that doesn't really kill that many people, although is more deadly than past respiratory viruses. We get, it seems to me, some familiar themes, that is, themes from previous utopian pursuits, communism being one of them. It's a new twist, right? If only the unclean and the unvaxxed and the deniers and the misinformed would get with a vaccine. And if only we could get there, we're not quite there yet, to a perfect vaccine, even one that covers maybe 4 different things that are threats to us, we could finally reach biomedical utopia, or at least in this one realm of science and protection, some sort of permanent safety against these things that occur in nature or are created in labs. It's an interesting push. That little bit about believers and non-believers is pretty revealing. This is, I think, the emerging rhetoric of some sort of, and it's not just on public health, it's on anti-racism and all the rest, but it's this weird new kind of theologically inflected globalist, anti-sovereignty, anti-nationalism, biomedical safetyist, sorry for all those, kind of ideological religious movement. And this is just the latest series of data points. But I thought that the report from the World Economic Forum was worth raising and pretty interesting, if not a bit horrifying.
Well, Klaus Schwab, I mean, I guess he sort of entered my radar maybe like, I don't know, a few years ago. I mean, it's just amazing to me. I mean, he's like Ernst Blofeld, like from the James Bond movies or something like this, like the head of Spectre or whatever he was the head of. I mean, he just seems like the classic baddie. And listening to him talk about what the, I saw this one clip from Davos where he's saying like, well, we have to talk about sustainability and climate and COVID. So I'm very proud to welcome Xi Jinping to the stage to enlighten us all. I mean, it's so perverse. And like everything they talked about in the 90s about one world government, or just every Bircher fantasy, every Bircher nightmare seems to be embodied in Klaus Schwab. I mean, it seems like the weirdest mix of like comedy and absolute like horror. I mean, just the fact that like, here's another question I have. Why is it that Bill Gates presumably knows a lot about computers, but why is he also a world expert on vaccines and on education? like everything he says is taken as like really like a serious like point that like we all have to listen to. And I guess the same thing goes with Klaus Schwab. I mean, who the hell is this guy?
I mean, I agree with you, Seth, that the Schwab stuff is all a little bit on the nose. Like the only thing he lacks is a mustache to twirl as he stands up at the podium and tells us about how we will all submit. But yeah, I mean, this is a classic. I don't know. I just had occasion to revisit the apology of Socrates, and I was struck by how this a repeated refrain that people that know a lot about one one, technical pursuit or science have this air as if they could like run the world. I mean, the part of those notes that really struck me, and she actually didn't editorialize on this, which surprised me. It just mentioned in passing that the medical community is a source of misinformation, which when you stop and think about it is a really remarkable thing to be saying. I mean, this is like, it's so out in the open that, the only people that may determine truth is our consortium of, basically saints, divines. And then that, we're going to combine all of this into just one giant vax, and it'll be the the mark of the beast, essentially, that you have to take in order to be readmitted into polite society. The funny thing is that with these people at this point, it's like, you know that you're not listening to the actual promises that they're making, because those are all nonsense. You're listening essentially to an advertisement of their governing philosophy. And it's been clear for a long time, there is simply no limiting principle here. I mean, there's a reason why Fauci doesn't think anything has gone wrong over the past 2 years plus. It's because this is, in fact, good in these people's eyes. It's not a mistake. It's not some kind of, they're not, saying the quiet part out loud as far as they're concerned. They see no reason why they shouldn't rule the world and, make everybody bend the knee. And, when you start talking about this, you do sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist until you point out that it's not like, some evil scheming mania. It's just a philosophy that, these are the anointed and they should rule. And the implications of that will out and have been, showing themselves to all who have eyes to see. We can talk about it until we're blue in the face, but, people that don't get this are still just like, it can't possibly be the case that they really do. They actually want to rule the world.
Well, yeah, there's a billboard that I have to drive by sometimes here in the failed state of Los Angeles. And it says, "We stand with science." And it's, one of these mega hospitals. We stand with science. That's one formulation. Believe the science. That's another formulation. There are a couple of them out there. But it's curious, irony alert. It's not really that curious, but it should be, that no one is going around saying worship science. When in fact, this is what's going on. This is what we're being urged to do. Of course, all these empiricists out there who think that they have transcended the primitive human habit of worshiping things would say, no, this is not worship. This is something much different. And arguably, it's not worship. It's idolatry, right? It's treating a thing that is meant to be a stand-in for a god in a particularly, fawning or devoted way. But of course, the idols do not have a sort of independent identity. They are, as Spencer, I'm sure, could explain better than even I.
Never, James, never.
Eidolon, right? It's a form, it's a figure, it's a likeness. It is a representation of something which cannot otherwise be represented, perhaps. And the fashioning of science into this kind of idol, this representation of something else about which we are really not encouraged to speak or inquire, that is clearly happening. And even if the experts themselves are smart enough to kind of carry on this intellectual and spiritual cat and mouse game with themselves and one another forever as concerns, what it is that they're really doing with science. What is their actual relationship? For ordinary people, including the many, many millions and perhaps billions of people whom these experts are telling to believe the science, it's not some kind of like, fun metaphysical sort of like talented Mr. Ripley situation that you can carry on in your infinite spare time. It's really just kind of getting down on your knees and prostrating yourself before, quote unquote, the science, which again is this kind of idol that's been fashioned to represent some other and greater thing. And, in that sense, like in this house, we believe that Klaus Schwab is an idol of that kind. He's this kind of thing that's been fashioned to stand in for and represent something bigger and something more powerful than himself. He is kind of a Blofeld, like a fantasy, something that's been created and trotted out before the public eye, so that the public can sort of fixate on this like weird man and his weird utterances, other than seeing the bigger picture. I'm not hinting that there's like a diabolical council of 13 shadowy figures who tell Klaus Schwab what to do every day. Because that itself is this kind of concoction that is used to obsess conspiracy theorists or whatever. There's the system is large and it's full of believers, and to focus the attention on Klaus Schwab as if he is really the person who we can kind of, if we focus on him, we can change things or fix things. I think that is not true, and our attentions are best directed, in other directions.
All right.
Well, that's the funny thing is he's just like he's almost like a comic, like front guy.
Yes.
I mean, it's almost as though he was put there to attract the eye, because he's so. I don't know. I have no idea who's behind him. I guess George Soros is really involved in the WEF. Whatever. It's so weird and surreal that it's hard to figure. Now, in that tweet thread, did they say that Africa doesn't want the viruses, the vaccines that are stored up?
Apparently, the African Union is not wanting a lot of them. But I mean, actually, Africa is interesting. It's not really reported at all about at all. South Africa a bit, but the rest of Africa, is, and it probably has to do with a much fewer, a much less obese population and a much younger population. But Africa has basically not really suffered a huge wave of COVID deaths, unlike a lot of the rest of the globe.
Yeah, and they've had very, very low vaccine,
right,
a very low vaccine,
10% or something. Yeah.
Like, what does this say about? They've only had a couple of 100,000 COVID deaths. So what does this say about COVID?
It says a lot of things.
Not racist, I guess. Unlike the rest of society.
We've heard
anti-racist.
We've heard plenty about how Black Americans and maybe some others have sort of historical skepticism towards vaccination and mandatory vaccination. What we don't hear a lot about is how Africans in Africa have good reason for an even greater degree of skepticism. One homework assignment that I gave myself was to finally get around to reading John le Carré's, I think it was a 2001 novel, which was adapted into a film that I guess a few people saw, The Constant Gardener, which is his book about the villain of international pharma, big pharma. And basically the plot of this book revolves around a shadowy international conglomerate that does many things, including arms deals, but runs a lot of money through the pharmaceutical industry. And this company has a field office in Nairobi, where our heroes kind of encounter it and deal with it and try to blow the whistle unsuccessfully. I don't think I'm giving away too much of the story to say that the workings of this pharma company that drive the plot involve the idea that where you find HIV, you tend to find tuberculosis, and so a drug that they kind of multi-purposed. They were using it, marketing it, packaging it in Africa as a sort of miracle cure for TB, and then implied HIV. And even though it was killing a bunch of people, they were basically just testing the product out in order to reach a threshold that convinced them that it would be acceptable, that it would pass scrutiny to then take the drug to market in the U.S. as an anti-HIV drug. So, yes, this is a work of fiction. I mean, on the other hand, you look at all the things that Le Carre wrote about, especially in that time period. The guy did his research. He had many friends in many places, and he traveled around, and he, wrote about them in their acknowledgments. The Tailor of Panama, he hung out down there. He went to the sort of training camps. He did the thing. He, knew, I think, much more about sort of money laundering in London than he let on, even though he wrote at least one novel about that. I think it was Our Kind of Traitor was that one. And so, it is known that Africa has been a sort of proving ground for pharmaceuticals, because if you can sort of get them over the hump of like, well, only X number of people died as a result of this drug, then you can start thinking about, unleashing it on the West. And obviously the provenance of the COVID vaccine, a little bit different here, but there are questions about, why were these vaccines developed in this way? What does it have to do with sort of the Gates Foundation, which is, I think, more or less the primary funder of the WHO as a result of kind of the channels that they flow money through. It all stinks, and no one's covering the corruption of big pharma, and certainly not on a global level, and certainly not during the COVID era. We're supposedly a country with a free press and freedom of speech, and a sense of mission and a desire to do justice for ordinary people. Well, this is a sitting duck for that kind of work, and yet, if you're listening for these kinds of investigative reports, you will hear crickets, as far as I know.
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about the Gates Foundation. It's like anytime the West is funneling drugs to Africa and Africa is saying, actually, no, I don't think we really want this. Like, Bill and Melinda Gates are there. I mean, Melinda Gates has been practically airdropping, pallets of contraceptives and like chemical abortion pills and what have you, any number of other, highly westernized drugs for ending your pregnancy or stopping yourself from getting pregnant at all. And, read like African activists like Obianuju Ekeocha, who writes at length about just the fact that this is a purely Western imperialist idea. African women, traditionally have no interest in such things. And of course, the grand irony in this, as in the, fantasy of COVID vaxing the entire world or mono-vaxing the entire world, is that these are the same people who bleat about the horrors of imperialism and the abuses of Western history. The British Empire, Winston Churchill, no British imperial servant ever dreamed of the kind of control that these people want to exert, blanketed across the entire world with no respect for local cultures, no interest in folkways or traditions, because as far as they're concerned, theirs is the only way, the only folkway, the only tradition is theirs. Everything else that deviates from what they think is right and true is simply a kind of primitive superstition which is outmoded and can be swept away with the flick of a button or the jab of a needle. And the arrogance of this is so galling precisely because it's too big for them even to see. It encompasses them like a cloud, and they have no way of thinking their way out of it because they can't understand that this is in fact their religion.
To answer your question from 10 minutes ago or so, Seth, I mean, you probably know this already, but no, I think people think of Gates, or at least the leadership class thinks of Gates as, that is Bill, as some sort of expert on education and vaccination and stuff, because it's a huge part of his philanthropy. And we have this conceit in this country that somehow if you, or at least the billionaires do anyway, somehow if you become a billionaire, you're a special sort of human being. And, you can then venture off into new areas. I think you see some of the same of this with Klaus Schwab. So, and then the last thing about Gates, picking up on one of your points, Spencer, I mean, it looks like there's been reporting over the last couple of months that the Gates Foundation's oral polio vaccine is actually giving people polio in Africa. So shocking that parts of African elite society like the African Union is not that interested in a COVID vaccine. All of this, I think, that encompassed in that tweet thread and some of the themes we've been bringing up are sort of made more alarming. Those trends are more alarming, I think, domestically in the United States when you see this latest Rasmussen poll. I'm just reading here from the Washington Examiner, which summarizes it. In an expanded survey of the public's view of mandates and punishments to get people vaccinated, Rasmussen found that Democrats even support fines, home confinement, and prison for those who fight the government on masks and shots. Over several questions in the survey for the Heartland Institute, so Heartland must have commissioned it, the differences in how Republicans and Democrats view the crisis were stark. 29% of Democrats would go so far as to support taking children away from parents who refuse to be vaccinated. The first question in the survey set the tone. It asked if likely voters approved of coronavirus czar Dr. Anthony Fauci. 21% of Republicans said they view him favorably compared to 75% of Democrats. Next came a question on President Joe Biden's mandate that companies of 100 employees or more should demand workers to get vaccinated. Of course, that's just made moot by the Supreme Court for now, at least for folks that don't take federal money. Just 22% of Republicans agreed, while Democrats were all in at 78%. Asked if voters favor a federal or state fine for those who refuse a vaccine, only 19% of Republicans said favor, 55% of Democrats. Rasmussen, these are the more alarming ones. Rasmussen next asked, well, taking kids from their parents, pretty alarming, but they next asked if people favor home confinement for those who are not vaccinated. On the GOP side, 79% were opposed, that is to home confinement for unvaxxed, while 59% of Democrats favored it. The survey also asked about those who challenged the government's view of vaccines and if opponents should be jailed or fined for questioning it on social media. A remarkable 48% of Democrats supported those punishments. And nearly half of Democrats favored fixing tracking devices on those who refused to vaccinate. So if you pair those domestic trends, we should give all the caveats for the limits of survey data, of course, but these are alarming trends to observe, especially when you have what seem to be, for now, the leading lights mostly insulated from political control of Western elite public health processes, which were encapsulated in that summary tweet thread, and you pair it with what seems to be the growing kind of soft biomedical authoritarianism of half the American population along partisan lines. It seems like yet another piece of the or section of the recipe for increasing civil strife, polarization, and American crack-up. Not encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about this last week where, I mean, the government, in 2020 imposed or ginned up essentially this kind of mass hysteria about COVID. And now, they seem like, okay, well, politically, that's not so useful for us right now. And I think they would like to move away from it. But once you've released this genie, I mean, how do you get it back in the bottle? So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. If half the country would be happy to strip children from their parents or jail or keep at home anyone who's not vaccinated, especially when you go forward, if you're going to have a permanent vaccine regime, does that mean that if you missed one of your one course, then you could go to jail? Where does this all lead? This is crazy. I mean, if you're going to have 50 million people in the country in a high-pitched state of terror about getting a cold or that their neighbors might infect them, I don't see how you can have a country.
Yeah. Well, we'll table that depressing topic for now. I'm sure it will crop up in other ways. As you reminded us, Seth, we kind of took this up last week as well. It's this rolling problem that I think one of the political parties in this country has really exacerbated, which is not to say that the Republicans were perfect, Trump included, on any of this COVID stuff over the last 2.5 years. We wanted to talk a little bit about Biden's press conference today, where he he basically extolled the wins of his first year in office and took some questions. Seth, God bless him, watched a lot of it, whereas the rest of us did not, although I saw reports of it. But Seth, what was your impression of the Biden brag fest?
Well, I mean, he said some really nutty things, as one might expect. I mean, he seemed to think that he's outperformed expectations. uh, that the infrastructure bill and the big COVID giveaway bills were like these amazing things that he did. But he kind of signaled a few weird things. He signaled that if Russia were to do just a small incursion into Ukraine, it wouldn't really be that big a deal. But he also indicated that it's pretty clear that the 2022 midterm elections are going to be illegitimate. So I mean, he's already setting that up, which is exactly what they're so mad at Trump for.
Right.
So, basically saying that without getting the John Lewis voting bill passed, the Republicans are going to be able to install all kinds of tripwires and people who can just dismiss fair and free elections, and so we're not going to have an illegitimate Congress being seated, is essentially what he was saying.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a pretty dismal press conference.
Yeah, we should add too that many of our listeners are savvy in such things, so have seen this develop as well. But the predicates are being laid at where they often are, not just there, but where they often are for democratic narrative shifting and ground preparing, and that's at the Atlantic with basically the coup continues. It's every day, and it's their way of talking about what you just mentioned, Seth, which Biden's now picking up as well, and we talked about last week, which is that unless you pass these highly partisan and highly federalizing election reforms, which are claiming that Jim Crow stalks the land once again, that the midterms will be illegitimate because the Republicans will have stolen them. I said the last session was depressing, but that's not good either. But everyone should be fighting against this as much as they can from platforms that they have. It's really nonsense. There's no Jim Crow 2.0 in Republicans' attempts to make sure that people who are voting are actually who they say they are. So this is how we need to view these things. I know, James, you had some thoughts on Ukraine. I will just drop a data point. This guy, Clint Ehrlich, I think you pronounce his name, a youngish guy, but a kind of scholar and researcher on all things Russia and Ukraine, et cetera, was on Tucker Carlson the other night. Last night, I think it was, perhaps the night before, talking about the foolishness of going to war with Russia over Ukraine, and just going through the ways in which some of the neoconservative and or neoliberal talking points on the stakes at issue and the intentions of Russia were incorrect in various ways. And Clint, that is, had this long tweet thread today where he just listed a lot of the reactions to his segment on Tucker. And it was pretty interesting, everyone from Bill Kristol to all manner of legal and media elites on the left side of the spectrum, or the never Trump center left of the spectrum, just basically saying that Tucker should register with FARA because he's basically a foreign agent. He's spewing Putin's propaganda. It's Glenn Greenwald pointed out also on Twitter the interesting fact, which is that if you're sort of an anti-war liberal and you pull yourself out of the current partisan moment, which network or which pundit on which network would you feel represented your views the best? And Greenwald's implication, of course, was it would be Tucker. And this is an interesting reversal of coalitions or elite coalitions in a way over Russia and NATO, et cetera. It's fascinating to watch in real time.
Yeah, as far as Ukraine goes, I mean, I certainly don't envy these diplomats who have to say things that they know are not true or are fantasies, and then act as if they are saying these things because they're so, and not because they're out of tools in the toolkit. They know as well as anyone that Ukraine is not a sovereign nation state in any real sense. They know that it is absurd and, it would be meaningless were it not for its sort of like indictment of its own logic to say that we will protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine at a time when the territorial integrity of Ukraine has been violated repeatedly, several times. You go back to John Kerry sort of spluttering when Russia reclaimed Crimea. This is not the 18th century. You can't do these things. And this is a substitute for policy that is being offered. I mean, they know very well that France and Germany and other European powers are definitely not going to war with Russia over where the boundary line falls in Ukraine. Just judging by what Putin and others have said, it seems pretty clear that as a matter of Russian foreign policy at this point, it would be undesirable to attempt to incorporate the whole of Ukraine into Russia. There's been talk of how you go back a few decades and the Russian part of Ukraine did not extend as far west as the western boundary of Ukraine now extends. Historically, that's Polish territory, and I think most Russians probably think of that chunk of Ukraine as really more or less being Polish rather than being Russian. So this all seems like a bizarre dance to me, and I understand why it's being done because let's face it, regardless of how much you take Putin's geopolitical acumen seriously, it's just embarrassing and unfortunate for America to have to kind of stand there in the court of public opinion and on the international stage and say, yeah, our principles and all the things that we talk about, our talking points, they really don't apply in this case. And there are other cases where they don't apply too, and we're not going to talk about those until those start falling apart as well. It's awkward. It's discrediting. It erodes the authority of the United States and its weird patchwork of alliances of various kinds. And it's just painful to see that unfolding. It is a deep-seated failure of the international order that we created after World War II. And the only way that it's going to be adjusted, aside from sort of, throwing up your hands and saying, Jesus, take the wheel, is to confess to some of these profound and protracted errors of strategy and of geopolitics and start doing the hard and humble work of correcting them. That's the only way that it's going to be done. But I mean, the people in this administration know that they are unable to take that work on, and much less to pull it off successfully. I think voters have a hoarse sense about this fact. And so we're all just sort of sitting here waiting to see if someone with those competencies is going to emerge from somewhere, whether it's the deep state or Congress or the White House or various governors' mansions. Like, who's it going to be? Where are they going to come from? Right now, there's just a very large, three-dimensional block letter question mark just sort of looming over the landscape in surrealist fashion. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I am by no means an expert or even particularly qualified to speak about foreign policy. Not that I think that's stopping most people on this issue when I scroll through Twitter. But I will just say, as a matter of domestic politics, it's demoralizing to see this president, of all people, stand up and feel as if the bluster he has to project and the strength that he has to establish is over the integrity of the borders of a country half a world away, which, James, as you say, is in itself sort of a moving target. When he shows almost no concern for the actual integrity of the actual borders of the actual country that he's running. I mean, I know that, it's a fool's game to point out hypocrisies, but this goes deeper than that. This amounts to, a kind of commitment, a kind of signaled commitment to a certain order over others. We were talking about, what sort of sovereignty, what sort of borders do our global elite believe in? And for President Biden to be saying, Putin's never seen sanctions like the one I promised will be imposed if he moves. It's bad enough that all of these, grand chest thumping pronouncements are going to have to be, modified and clarified in retrospect and shirked away from and scrambled back from. That's bad enough. But this is what he thinks he needs to sound off on. This is where he thinks he can beat his chest is just, incredibly insulting. And I would imagine that a lot of people, especially people near the southern border of this country, are listening to this and thinking, what about us? Right? I mean, this is the main reason why Tucker Carlson now speaks for the anti-war left and why this kind of realignment is happening is because gradually patriotic, freedom-loving Americans that, sent their kids to war to fight and die, watched the disaster in Afghanistan and suddenly realized that the people they were fighting for didn't give, a rat's ass about them. And that's basically the message that I'm getting from this Ukraine nonsense too.
Yeah, and it sort of makes me think again how correct and how early Pat Buchanan was. 25, it seems like he was 25 years ahead of schedule. But he was making a lot of these, this paleocon type warnings about foreign adventuring. Let me just ask, one thing I could never understand was the Democrats just went so crazy about how Trump was Putin's puppet and how he was soft on Russia. And he just wanted to let Putin do anything he wanted. Yet it was under Obama that Putin invaded Crimea and annexed it. And the U.S. did nothing. I mean, maybe it set up some sanctions. I mean, they essentially did nothing. And then given Biden's weird financial interests in Ukraine, it all seems like some crazy projection. I mean, this seems like something that it's going to take decades to unravel and to really understand what's going on here. But it feels like I don't know exactly how it's all twisted together, but it does seem like there's a lot of protestation that's not really very honest. Let's just put it that way.
To pick up on an earlier thread, it should be the golden age of investigative journalism. I mean, there's so many ripe targets out there, whether it's the virus business, the vaccine stuff, the corruption of big pharma, the she doth protest too much nature of the Democratic Party on Ukraine, maybe, and Russia. It's and yet I don't want to say there's not a market for such journalism. I think there is, but we're in an environment where there's not enough good money on the right to fund it, and the left is hell-bent on cementing and continuing the legacy media, or actually our friend, I won't name him because he didn't authorize me, but one of our friends in the academic world who's full of good ideas thought we ought to start calling the mainstream media or the legacy media the trust fund media. I thought that was pretty good because it's filled with spoiled and often mediocre children of the former legacy media. Anyway, that's there should be more of it. I should point out one bright spot in this field, and I've pointed it out before, but Real Clear Investigations is doing some of this kind of work, mostly domestic stuff. But and then on the more kind of opinion investigative side, it's real journalism too. I've mentioned them before. I actually had a conversation today with the founder of it. I'm 1776. They've got this multi-part series on the UK and on big foundations in the UK, and so there are some glimmers of light, which people should check that out, both those sites out, and perhaps in our future, we've talked about it before. There'll be some more funding for and pursuit of real investigative journalism, but there's just so many ripe targets out there. A lot of work to do.
Speaking as the mediocre child of a media magnate who has personally made his career in media, I just object to the characters.
Sorry, Spencer. That was not aimed at you.
No,
implicitly. No, you've branched out into other fields. Your father is not an expert on classics. He ain't got no fancy PhD like you. So
true enough, and I'm not as funny as my grandfather, who was a shock jock on morning radio. So
right.
I guess we've all got our own spheres.
That's right. We should tell everyone that the Spencer Klavan is a third generation media American media. So your grandfather's
third generation trust fund baby. Yeah.
Yeah, right. No, if only then you could help us do much more with the American mind. With
That's
your
true.
trust
Then I
fund.
could be the source of that funding you were talking about. No, but I was talking to Mark Helprin actually on the CRB podcast, who writes our column in the back, the Parthian Shot. And he revealed to me that he had listened to my grandfather growing up, that he lived in New York, and that was the first Klavan he ever knew. So there you are.
Very good.
So I am the nepotistic weirdo that you've heard about.
Yeah. For those of our listeners who are wondering what Spencer's talking about, it's probably not that many of you. Go check out The Close Read, which is the Claremont Review Books podcast. Does not appear weekly like this one, but takes up some nice issues in interview form from each issue of the Claremont Review Books. And everyone should go listen to Mark Halperin's interview he did with Spencer. Mark writes on political and international things for us on the back of the Claremont Review Books. But Mark, of course, is also an acclaimed writer of fiction, and has some great books if you want to go check those out. I encourage you to do so. We should end with maybe some happy news in a bit of a turnaround. Boris Johnson announced, I think today was the announcement in Parliament that they are lifting in the UK vaccine and face mask mandates and encouraging people to go back to work. Boris has been kind of a mixed bag, to say the least, on COVID. He seemed for the past couple years to be, in our view, I think a little too cowed by the British medical expert establishment and the UK has been kind of, what seems to us, a little paranoid and overreactive to a lot of these things. But Bojo seems to have reversed course on this. It'll be interesting to watch the response of the deep state in the UK, or the administrative state. In many ways, the civil service there is more robust, entrenched, and centralized, as it's probably easier to be on an island like that than it is in the US. So I suspect that this is pretty unpopular with a good portion of the voters of Britain, probably not a majority, but especially unpopular with the consensus across the international and internationalist medical bureaucracy. So it would be an interesting one to watch, to see the reaction. Johnson in recent weeks has gotten in a bit of hot water because of his somewhat cavalier approach at 10 Downing to masks and COVID precautions. I think it was in the tabloid press a few days ago that Johnson got caught having a garden party at the prime minister's residence without proper masking, et cetera, and people were up in arms. So one solution to that is just to lift all the restrictions. So God bless him for that. There's probably something to watch. It's maybe a sign of a crack amongst many cracks in the COVID madness across the Anglosphere.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Sometimes it seems like the Brits, maybe they've got more common sense than we do. I mean, I guess that's their long claim to fame, but I hear Britain is now called Turf Island because they've gotten so the sensible thought on the trans question seems to be really rooted there. You can talk about it more openly than you can here without fear of being silenced. I don't really know that much about it, but look, maybe it's all positive. What can I say?
Yeah, easier to change course, of course, in a parliamentary supremacy setup where the majority party can really change on a dime in a way that, as long as you hold the confidence of your party, and you don't find the need to call an intervening election. But the mechanics of switching policy are easier in many ways in the UK. Although, as I said, the civil service has ways in which it can meddle. Although we should add, it's a little less equipped to meddle now because it's not enmeshed anymore, at least formally, in the European Union. So that has probably helped as well.
Yeah, the party confidence issue is what makes this all kind of curious. I mean, to me at least, it's a very sudden about face. It's phrased in these terms that we got in California too, or anywhere with these weird little tiered restrictions. Right now we're in the purple zone. Now we're in the magenta zone. Now it's striped. Now there's polka dots. And this is the same. Johnson said I've gone back to Plan A essentially out of Plan B, which is their version of this. And as you mentioned, Ryan, Johnson's had a number of scandals of a type that has become incredibly familiar to us at this point. It's the Nancy Pelosi thing where you get caught in a hair salon or whatever. They've been having parties at 10 Downing, and as well they should, except that then they should let everybody else do the same thing. I mean, it's not like we're against parties. It's just that the hypocrisy is so appalling. And it's my understanding, at least, that Johnson doesn't actually have an enormous sort of like base, a wellspring of support to rely on. I get the sense he's attacked from the right and the left, within his party and without. And all of that makes me wonder just what exactly is going on behind the scenes here. Just as I wonder with, when, CNN and MSNBC and the trust fund media start to suddenly admit that actually COVID can't be stopped by cloth masks or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, you wonder what's going on and how long it will last. I hope it's just the recovery of that old British common sense, a la the Barons and King John. Just like the COVID Magna Carta will soon issue forth from the British Isles. But I also sort of feel as if I'm not sure about this one. It seems like there's more to this story.
Probably not the beginning of a anti-COVID madness, glorious revolution.
Alas, no.
Yeah. Well, we will. Praise people when they do good, including our political leaders and our friends across the pond. So good for Johnson, and it'll be one to watch. And that'll do it for us for today. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our new, not so new anymore, a year old, as I mentioned last week now, the Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate us well, share, subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. Go check out, as I said, The Close Read, if you haven't looked at it yet, with Spencer Clavin, Associate Editor of the Claremont Review Books, as host. Very many interesting things on that podcast. Essays on public policy, literature, and all the rest. And thank you, as always, to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. Thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.